So this is just a short video that I wanted to show. And we had an interview at the end of last year with Reuters on the first phase of the program, which we'd rolled out last year. And then unbeknownst to us, I did an interview with them. And next thing I know, I had this video popped in my inbox. And I think really, given the fact that I'm trying to keep things short and sweet, this is quite a good way to be able to provide a synopsis on the program.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today's session is the trade union takeover. So you're in the right place. Yes, finally. Okay, so welcome to this afternoon's session. Today's side event is titled A Just Climate Finance Regime for a Just Energy Transition Partnership. So with the launch of the JETP-IP on Friday, I guess there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of thinking around, what's the most just way to think about finance in order to bring about the just transition imperatives that we all seem to think about. What's clear is that the private investment is probably going to take care of itself. What becomes more complicated in the broader scheme of things is how do we mobilize finance in order to deal with the social aspects of the just transition, which are very critical considering South Africa's structural issues and structural problems that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. So to help me unpack this very difficult concept and to deal with some of the other thinking in terms of this broader question of how we factor in social and financing the social aspect of our transition is Dr. Basani Baloy, who's the senior researcher for the Institute for Economic Justice, as well as Professor Celine Tan, who is the professor at the University of Warwick. I'm going to start off with Professor Celine if you could maybe give us your initial thoughts in terms of unpacking the subject matter for us, and then straight after that, we'll go into a presentation from Dr. Basani. Over to you, Prof. Celine.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, I was not expected to be the first speaker because I think I was listed as the third one on my list. So I'm not sure whether Basani, do you want to go first and then kind of like set the scene, and then I can come in with the what I have to.
That's fine, Prof. We'll take Basani first, and then
that's brilliant, because what I think will be complementary, because I think Basani will give the kind of local issues, and then what I can do is then flip out to the macro. That's okay.
Perfect. Basani, you'll come in, and then after that, we'll take Prof. Celine. Thanks, Celine. You can hear me. Excellent. If I can just be helped with the slides. Oh, okay. Thank you. Next slide, please. Just to say that this presentation or output was put together by myself and my colleague Jezri Krinsky, who's unfortunately not here with us, but just to acknowledge his effort as well. So the purpose of this presentation is first to explain the implications of a de-risking climate financing regime through the use of blended finance and public-private partnerships in energy generation, that is IPPs, on a just energy transition using the JET IP as a case. Secondly, it's to outline possible climate financing pathways that may support a just energy transition and their associated risk. Next slide. So the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a climate financing deal entered into between the governments of South Africa and a set of global North countries to mobilize finance in support of South Africa's decarbonization strategy. Already about 8.5 billion US dollars has been committed, and the major sources of financing are loans at about 81%, mostly in concessional loans that dominate, and then grants occupy about 4%. Next slide, please. This financing is being targeted mostly at the electricity infrastructure sector, which enjoys 89.4% of committed JET-P finance, with a focus on private provision of energy over the near term. This will be in the form of an accelerated rollout of independent power producers, whose merits I'll get to later. But it's important to say that only 0.3% of committed JET-P finance is targeted towards economic diversification and innovation, and 0.1% of committed JET-P finance is targeted towards skills development. Next slide, please. So there are 4 critical concerns that the IEJ has with the JET-P financing. The first is prioritize private sector profit opportunities on infrastructure, all the while the state assumes quite a lot of the risk. It worsens fiscal conditions as IPP lock in Eskom into expensive forms of provisioning. The third is that it exacerbates energy poverty. And then the fourth is that it perpetuates the minerals energy finance complex by disincentivizing the industrialization of the renewable industry necessary for decent work creation. Next slide, please. So IPPs are highly leveraged assets, meaning they have high debt to equity ratios that average around 80% to debt to 20% equity,
on average to produce 5 gigawatts of energy, which is more than Eskom at 44 gigawatts. Some IPPs have even had higher leverage at 95% debt to 5% equity. The private sector project owners apply measures to de-risk this debt exposure, this risk exposure, by first financing their projects through what they call off-balance sheet financing, meaning they create separate entities that are not listed on the stock exchange and thus don't report their financial statements. And they make these entities absorb the debt and the risks and rewards associated with the project. So private finance is also de-risked by mobilizing public money through mechanisms such as first blended finance, which combines public concessional finance as well as grants with private finance. And the presence of public finance at concessional rates as well as grants reduces the cost of financing the private finance, right? So second, they de-risk through also demand guarantees that are instruments that oblige Eskom to pay a set revenue to the IPP throughout the lifetime of the contract. Third, there are also contract lock-ins that force Eskom to pay this set guarantee over a long period of normally 20 years. And these contracts are inflexible and result in heavy penalties should Eskom not afford to honor them. With the risks significantly reduced, and once the IPP is in operation, the private sector is free to extract future revenue streams that can accrue in year 15, for example, in the year 7 of the infrastructure operation by refinancing the loan and also reselling the shares of the IPP in secondary markets to make more money. Therefore, the rewards are privatized while the risks are socialized. Next slide, please. Until recently, IPPs required state-backed guarantees. That is a guarantee that the state will be able to pay the loan obligations should the need arise. And this would be required to make these the IPPs bankable, right? Or profitable. The private provisioning of energy needs about 5 times more backing by the state than Eskom under bid window 1 to 4. And in line with this, it is welcome that the JET IP appears to move away from state-backed guarantees in the REAP. However, this is only for future IPPs because the JET IP's contingent liability section, which is where state-backed guarantees would sit, makes no mention of the reduction or the removal of REAP state-backed guarantees under bid window 1 to 4, choosing only to focus on mechanisms to reduce Eskom's state-backed guarantees. So such a reduction in state-backed guarantees for bid window 1 to 4 would require the state to enter into renegotiations with those IPPs so that the state can implement a considered sustainable solution to managing this public liability. Previously, attempts by the state to renegotiate contract terms to manage Eskom's fragility were thwarted by the IPP sector's threats of court action. And this implies that the status quo of high state exposure to IPP state-backed guarantees will remain with the risk borne by the state and the profit reaped by the IPPs. Next slide, please. It has been cheaper to produce energy due to the falling price of renewables at successive bidding rounds. Demand guarantee lock-ins of early bid rounds prevent the benefits of current cheaper market prices. So Eskom CEO, Mr. De Ruyter, and Public Enterprise Minister, Gordhan, proposed the renegotiation of bid window 1 and 2, which were highly subsidized by feed-in tariffs. But the private sector, empowered by extremely costly lock-in clauses, threatened court action. And lock-ins, because lock-ins give the IPPs a sort of a monopoly position where they are less subject to competitive pressures once built. This inflexibility serves then to deepen Eskom's fiscal fragility. Next slide, please. Now, the JET IP frames the energy poverty as a grid access issue, right? Even though it acknowledges that about 80% of households in South Africa have access to the grid, which is quite high. What it neglects, however, is that energy poverty in South Africa is an affordability issue, right? People can't actually afford energy, right? Still, the JET-IP focuses on cost-reflective tariffs to support a privatized energy system that it envisions. So cost-reflective tariff structures should more honestly be labeled as cost plus profit plus interest reflective tariffs, as the normal rates of profits are actually naturalized and hidden and made to be costs. So this is necessary to guarantee the revenue streams that the state has promised the private sector in their demand guaranteed offtake agreements. Therefore, heavy reliance on private finance could produce pressure to increase user fees. So of the 319 billion rand targeted for catalytic investments for municipalities by the JET-IP, 0.2 billion is targeted towards knowledge generation or research models for cross-subsidization. Therefore, the JET-IP does not make investment commitments to substantively support the free basic electricity subsidy for poor households, which will be needed as embedded generation comes on stream at greater scale. Next slide, please. So with regards to job creation potential will be in the renewable energy manufacturing sector, amongst others, and not in the electricity generation sector. There will be a need for a balance between adequate energy infrastructure investment for energy access and adequate renewable energy manufacturing investment for job creation. The investment needs for the localization of renewable energy value chain is estimated at 418 billion rand to meet the integrated resource plan. The JET-IP apportions only 1.6 billion to the localization of clean value chains, which is equal to 0.4% of the investment need for localization. So the JET-IP apportions 648 billion to electricity infrastructure, right? Decommissioning, distribution, generation, transmission. Now the imbalance will continue the dominance of South Africa's existing growth path, the minerals energy finance complex, which is not a job creator. Robust industrial financing that supports the industrialization of renewable energy value chain is necessary to counterweight the short-term price rise associated with the renewable localization sector's development. Without the cheap financing that the renewable energy generation sector receives to make it competitive, then the renewable energy manufacturing sector will falter because the IPP sector will continue to resist industrial policy measures that impact the cost competitiveness of inputs into renewable energy generation, because their objective is to maximize profit at least cost, no matter the developmental implications. Next slide, please. So a just energy transition financing pathway must ensure that climate or environmental policies are supported by robust industrial policy and social policy and an appropriate financial resource mobilization. There are a couple of pathways we speak about. The first is, okay, we live in a world where IPPs exist. How do we ensure that we can regulate these things so that an appropriate risk return sharing scheme is met to benefit both public interest and the private, if at all? Some measures that could be in place are contracts to be made public so that there's oversight and there's risk management, or there is cost comparisons between what public IPPs or public-private partnerships can provide with, and those are compared with public-private, with public provisioning in order to aid decision-making, so we are indeed getting the least cost option. So we shouldn't go by this idea that let's just go PPPs without actually making these cost comparisons between the public and the IPPs. There also needs to be the improvement of state negotiation capacity and capability, empowered by a policy framework that does not allow them to enter into contracts that generate fragility. There's also a need for robust localization policy that needs to be enforced. However, there are risks here, and which is that to enforce such terms, you are up against a global financial architecture that has prioritized minimizing private sector risk exposure and maximizing profit opportunity. And this global financial architecture includes the Bretton Woods institutions and financial market actors and the global north countries. Another risk is that it requires a strong state that can discipline the private sector and not be captured by vested interests from the banking or the IPP sector to direct state policy to line their pockets to the detriment of the just energy transition. Another pathway, second pathway, is debt cancellation and reparations for climate justice as a public pathway energy system. The second is saying, okay, we can still build a public pathway to a renewable energy system, but this would require the cancellation of the World Bank's odious debt and climate reparations owed by corporations and global north countries to the global south. The dominance of grants over loans would be very key here, and the wider creation of redistributing special drawing rights from surplus global north countries to deficit global south countries. So SDRs basically allow countries to have access to foreign currency in times of emergency, as in the case of this climate crisis. The risk is that this requires a fair and just multilateral climate financing regime, which currently does not exist. Moreover, the problematic multilateral climate financing regime that we do have will be further weakened, will be made further weakened by bilateral climate finance. A deal with one country brokering a deal with 5 powerful countries may look different to a deal that is brokered between 152 developing countries versus 36 developed countries, as an example. So the final pathway is allocative green credit pathway. And this is taken from the sterling work of Katie Edward and Diana Gabor and others who have just released a paper called Aligning Finance with Green Transition from a risk-based to an allocative green credit policy. They draw on the experience of East Asian tigers to develop their economies using policies that integrate financial, monetary, fiscal, and industrial policy to ensure that finance is directed towards productive investments that can catalyze development so that the dynamics of private allocation do not undermine the overall developmental strategic objectives of the state. So integrated with environmental policies, these allocative green credit policies are central to directing investments towards sustainable, productive investments to ensure a just energy transition or a green transition more broadly. These policies come in 2 forms. direct and indirect credit policies, both of which can be directed towards the banking system, as well as institutional capital such as pension funds, insurance, and asset managers. The indirect allocative policies are monetary policies that are aimed to adjust the relative costs of providing capital to different sectors on favorable terms, on favorable versus unfavorable terms, depending on whether the sector is dirty or green. So for instance, a bank's reserve requirements can be made high, or credit guarantees can be dispensed, and loan refinancing terms can be made favorable depending if the sector is financed as green or dirty. And then you have direct allocative credit policies, which are monetary policies that are more coercive in that they directly intervene to set the price or the quantity of bank credit for particular sectors. So this was not only done in East Asia, but it was also done by the apartheid government back in the day. And that is how we actually industrialized the South African economy, but based on a fossil fuel type of energy system. But this time you give a direct mandate for these investments in green economy sectors. So this is a way of doing domestic resource mobilization. So we argue that given the finite resources and the catalytic role of the state, that these incentives and mandates must be directed towards sectors that are green, can create jobs, and are too nascent or infant to attract private capital, such as in the renewable industry manufacturing sector. So the risk here is that you will be opposed by the Bretton Woods institutions and the economic orthodoxy that is well established within the National Treasury and also the Reserve Bank, that is supported by not only the Washington Consensus, but also what Daniela Cobo calls the Wall Street Consensus. Thank you.
We're going to go straight into the presentation by Professor Celine Tan, and then we'll give you 20 minutes to do your presentation, and then we'll take questions for your presentation as well as the one that Basani has just made. So over to you, Prof. Prof, you're on mute.
Sorry. Can you see my screen? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, brilliant. I'm just going to, this is always the terrible thing. I've done this a million times. So I am just going to, I think you are now seeing the presenter view, aren't you? Rather than, let me just swap that. Hopefully you're now seeing the actual slides, right? So I'm just going to come from this position. I'm going to shift out. Basani has just given quite extensive overview of the JTAB. And I think that's really very multifaceted and very detailed presentation. And I can't really add much to the little details and the technical details of the JTAB. Where I would like to come in is kind of from an international economic law perspective and a kind of global financial architecture perspective, which I think Basani touched upon, and I think it's really important when we look at these transition kind of packages and how the climate finance architecture is basically moving to this kind of mobilization of private finance. I think that's the big key thing now that's been in discussion at the international level and also at sort of national level, that the narrative that the state can't provide it, official financiers can't provide the resources that is necessary for climate action, and that we've got to move towards mobilization of private finance. I think Basani's just set out quite a significant number of concerns that we might have have with that process. And I'd like to set out the kind of more macro perspective on this and the implications I think that civil society and sort of state governments in developing countries might want to think about in terms of looking at these financial resources, because I think they have very significant implications on countries' ability to engage with the global economy, but also importantly, the countries' abilities to actually do the just transition. So there's a lot of impact that actually paradoxically will constrain countries' space to move towards this kind of green decarbonized economy that we want to. And I think that's quite important for us to think about. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of highlight here is that when we're talking about the legal policy architecture of climate finance, we're looking at two very, very separate regimes. And these two separate regimes, I think Bassani highlighted earlier as well, are completely disconnected in a way in terms of their interactions. And I think now we're looking more at this, movement to align it, but I'm not necessarily convinced that it's going to be aligned in the way that is in a more equitable direction. So if we look at the global climate regime, those of you who are there in Egypt, and I'm really sorry I'm not, is that that these are obligations, right? There are obligations to undertake mitigating measures. There are obligations to undertake, financing to developing countries. The developed countries have greater obligations to mitigate. They provide finance and technology transfer to developing countries. And this principle of equity in common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is really central to that regime. That's not what you have in the financial architecture. This global financial system will be absolutely central to this mobilization delivery of climate finance going forward. I mean, as we have heard through, as Bassani has said, and through the kind of case study of the JTEP, we can see that actually a lot of this will be directed through these international financial institutions, through the financial global financial architecture, international financial institutions, but they are very challenging because there's structural deficits inherent in them, right? It's very fragmented. There isn't a single kind of global policy institution. The IMF plays an important role, but governance of the IMF and these institutions are really problematic. So this fragmentation is going to impede coordinated action on climate action, right? And then importantly, developing countries like South Africa and all the other middle and low income countries have much less voice and representation in the international financial architecture than at this climate regime. I mean, the finance agenda will be set by developed countries. I'll go into that in a minute. How? And it's really fully aligned with development cooperation principles, even when you look at it. So there is a real problem when we then start routing climate finance through private financial instruments, through public-private finance, which marginalizes state civil society from these architectures, these global mechanisms of decision making. So I think we need to kind of look and kind of think through the differentials in these systems and where, climate finance is going to be delivered. So that's just briefly where we see ourselves, I think, which is relevant to the implementation of JTAB. We've got mainstreaming of climate considerations into policy making, mobilizing, leveraging private finance, and retooling public finance to climate action. A lot of this is, fundamentally inherent in how the JTAP is going to be implemented, because it will feed through the kind of global policies, will look very much, be implemented through these kind of national packages. And we kind of need to kind of realize how they do that. I think one of the key areas that I think JTAP and other sort of packages like that need to be looked at from a lens is to look at these mechanisms as an attempt to create markets for public good investments, and climate finance being one serious part of it. And how this is being done is through international development policy and operational practice by creating financial incentives. And I think Bassani kind of really outlined them in quite detail there, and how financial incentives are created in terms of providing finance to lower the risk of investors, willing to lend to sovereign, non-sovereign entities, investing in SDG related areas or climate related areas. Then you've got the other secondary part of it, which is the regulatory incentives, right? So the creation of improved regulatory environments to encourage investor access. And that's the crucial part of it, I think, here. When we think about these financial packages, in what way are is this move? Because I think JTEP talks a lot about creating the enabling environment. And I always get a little bit concerned when international financial institutions talk about creation of enabling environments, because they're not necessarily enabling for the right reasons. And I think we need to look at how those policy and legal changes are creating pipelines of investable projects for these markets. And through these, audit mechanisms, changing corporate company law, governance, environmental, social governance regimes, all look on the surface really, exciting and incentive and pro climate action. But I think we can see, just even from the case study of data, that it is really problematic, and we really need to take a step back and think about what that means. And I think I just wanted to go through some of the concerns with this movement to this kind of private finance driven modality of delivering climate finance, which is that this rapid diversification of actors, right, it would complicate the oversight and accountability of development and climate finance, right? If the further away we move from the multilateral climate regime in terms of the reporting and accountability mechanisms within it, towards these kind of climate clubs, bilateral partnerships like JTEP, there is a danger that we will kind of lose this ability to map, track, and account for financial flows, right? So the monitoring regimes, how certain finance are mobilized, how much of it is mobilized, where does it go to? This is really problematic. And when we go into kind of climate finance markets governed by industry-led private governance regimes, this increases the risk of regulatory capture by private interest groups. So you have stakeholders, including developing country governments, local communities, civil society, they become passive beneficiaries of standards. So if you look at all the standards that is being set now in terms of determining what constitutes ESG or climate disclosure benchmarks, they're all primarily driven by sort of, the main financial centers and private actors. There's very little input from, the global south in these private networks, but yet these benchmarks are going to be very crucial in terms of determining access to capital for developing countries in the future. So I think this is really important. And also the other thing for more at a more local community level, there is a lack of disclosure and grievance mechanisms, right? It makes it really difficult to then ask for disclosure about impact, environmental, social impact of projects, because they're rooted through private finance. Again, it's very much project-based level where these disclosure grievance mechanisms are taking place, rather than, let's say, you have the World Bank and the inspection panel mechanisms of ombudsmen at international financial institutions and things like that. So you've got a problem with accountability and oversight when you move into these kinds of areas. The other area, again, something that Sani had raised her concern with, and I echo that, is this issue of deepening the financial exposure to capital market instability. So the more we move to private finance, the more we move to reliance on private capital and international capital markets for financing very, very important public goods like climate action. You're exposing, increasing the porousness of developing countries to global financial conditions. And we've seen, I'm based in the UK where, I think everybody pretty much knows what happened. They had a financial meltdown, a month ago after the mini budget. We all know that, even a country like the UK, with, quite a significant, it was quite highly significant financial center, can be exposed to this, very unstable regime if once you're exposed to the financial market. So I think there is a really, I would say that we need to be really cautious when we move to private financial finance as a source of financing, because really does also expose developing countries to changes not only in financial conditions of systematically important countries, but also the policy and regulatory changes, right? So any changes to, for example, asset management or pension fund standards within, the systematically important countries will have an impact on developing countries' ability to raise capital, because, those sort of patient capital, which is, what the financial institutions want developing countries to attract, will then have their own, ability to invest, constrained by regulatory changes. So they might have to, which is what we saw happen in the UK financial markets, dump bonds, for example, because they can't hold certain liabilities, over a certain period of time if the financial conditions changes because of regulatory constraints. So we have all these impacts that once we move into the privatized financial markets, loops developing countries into a framework which is much more complicated. Then, of course, you have these enabling environments that do constrain governments, and you can lose control over the pace and direction of credit creation within your own economies as a consequence of that. And there's no evidence that this kind of private ordering regimes, that the whole ISSB standards, ESG standards, anyway will overcome the structural deficits within the international financial markets, because green bonds are just principles. They are not subjected to any additional regulation that will support countries in a case of debt default or debt distress. Okay, so you might want to issue a green bond, but what if you can't pay up or you're in debt distress? There is a real problem. There is nothing there to protect countries from that kind of debt. You still have to repay your debt. There's no condition attached to that which will allow countries to insist on a haircut or a suspension to that. So the alignment of capital markets and financial markets to climate action needs to be much more fundamental than just tinkering with this kind of templates for contractual regulatory governance at that point. And as I said, the shift to private finance really exacerbates debt vulnerabilities. It's something that South Africa and other developing countries need to really think about. So the private finance to the private sector can shift the balance of the government books, but is a large contingent liabilities. And, I think the government guarantees, these are all issues that I think we need to think about. The structures of these kind of specific sustainable development instruments, like climate green bonds, for example, like I said, they don't address the systemic vulnerabilities. And we have also seen from our experience with the collective action clauses, which were introduced for sovereign debt instruments, bonds, over the last 15 years, they haven't really made a difference in terms of making a dent in the kind of stability of the sovereign regime, or made, in fact, a restructuring of debt that much more sustainable for developing countries. So contractual mechanisms are problematic as well. So I just want to probably end with a couple of a couple of things, which is policy recommendations, and also kind of like exhortation of how we kind of like link the climate regime with the kind of like international global financial system. My 4 recommendations would be that you need to look at the promotion of financial markets within the JTEB and other sort of financial packages as one source of financing. It has to be embedded within a broader suite financial options for developing countries and not a substitute for more stable forms. I think Basani kind of like outlined that in her final slide. There are alternatives to kind of the more unstable instruments, and there should be adequate debt sustainability assessments before sovereigns issue sustainable finance securities, because one of the big thing now is that countries should go and issue green and sustainability linked bonds, and I would suggest that countries look into that much more seriously, and do impact assessments before entering into those instruments. And again, issuing of sovereign bonds need to align with country priorities for social, economic development, climate action. Otherwise, what you get is that you will be driven by what investors want to fund and not necessarily what is in the country's kind of interest to fund, right? And to finance in terms of this transition. There has to be a greater harmonization of ESG standards. There's a lot of greenwashing out there. Apart from the greenwashing, there's also the fact that these standards are being developed in regimes that aren't very democratic or accountable. The more we move in financing to the capital markets, these are the regulations, these are the regulatory arenas that civil society groups in developing countries are not part of. But yet these standards that are going to be developed at these, International Capital Markets Association, at the International Sustainability Standards Boards, those are the standards that will be governing developing countries' access to capital in the future, and will be used in climate risk assessments. It will be used in credit ratings of countries, and I think this is really important that we think about how this is actually quite disenfranchising of developing countries within this. So it's kind of a more broader macro view, I think, that we need to take when we look at these financing options. So I will end with my last slide here, and I apologize if I've taken much more time. If we want, when we look at climate finance, I think it's really important that we look at the alignment of the global financial system with the commitments of the multilateral climate architecture, right? And not allow ourselves to be moved on to these kind of plurilateral mechanisms and packages, because ultimately bring it back to what is the principles governing the regimes, which is principles of equity, CBDR, transparency, accountability, reform of the existing legal and regulatory landscape of international finance. If the finance is delivered as part of a development cooperation package, this needs to be clear. So I'm not clear, maybe Basani can sort of like enlighten me on this, whether or not the GTEP is going to be part of the these developed countries financial commitments under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, or are they going to be delivered and counted as part of existing order flow, which would be like not what we should do. And then they also must meet agreed principles of agreed principles on aid effectiveness. And then the third thing I would say is that it's really important for climate finance to be part of a broader package of reforms to the current system of global economic governance and international economic law. This really means examining how the choice of financing instruments affects South Africa's commitments under international economic law, how it impacts on the policy space of the government to implement national plans, and really importantly, is it going to impact international investment agreements, trade agreements, and the sovereign debt management and governance? And I think these are all questions that I think we need to ask, not just South Africa, but all the other countries which are entering into these kind of more bilateral deals for climate finance. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Prof. Celine Tan. Very important points that the both of you have raised in your presentations: the need for robust industrial policy and robust social policy, and how the two can complement one another. Monitoring regimes for the JET IP, and how financing must be driven by a country's industrial needs over and above anything else. I'm just going to open it up for questions or any inputs that anyone would like to raise at this time. The presenters are here. They're probably keen to answer questions. We don't have that much time left. So if there are any questions or inputs, I'll just see with a show of hands. No questions. You're happy with the presentation? Everything's all good. Oh, I thought I saw. Okay.
There are some questions in the chat, I believe.
Trying to see. Yeah, they're not necessarily questions to the panelists per se. Are there any questions, colleagues? Okay. Okay, I see a question from Anne on the chat. I think you can raise your question. You can talk.
I don't really, I had a question. I had a question that I raised in the question and answer session, but I think you said that you would address that. It's really about access to the PowerPoint presentation. I came in late and I've had a very poor and unstable internet connection from Extinction Rebellion Nelson Mandela Bay in a rural area. Thanks.
All right, thank you. We will circulate all of the presentations. Thank you. I just want to see, there's a hand from Janet. If you could maybe ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question for Basani. She mentioned that the effect of the JETP financing would be to disincentivize the industrialization of the renewable energy industry locally. I just wanted to ask you to clarify what do you mean by that? Why would it why would it have the effect of disincentivizing industrialization of the renewable energy industry? Thanks.
All right, thank you. And then I see there's one more hand from Tatefinias Malapela. If you could pose your question quickly.
My question is on this finance. How is it going to be decentralized to the level of the community organizations? How will the community organizations really benefit?
Thank you, Dr. Phineas. Thank you. Okay, that's it in terms of questions, colleagues. We're going to take those questions and give an opportunity to the panelists to probably do a quick response. I'm going to ask you to respond from there, Pasani.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The question from Janet is very important. So the basic is that the JET-IP is basically an infrastructure plan, right? A lot of the money is going into the energy infrastructure, which we need. We need to ensure that we have an ESCOM or an energy system that works, that can deliver power. That's very important, right? The question, the second part of it is that the JET-IP basically sets that ESCOM is not going to go into its own renewable energy provision, and much of the focus will be in accelerating IPPs. So that's where a lot of the money is going to go in the near future, and then later on through embedded generation, all that. So IPPs are the primary mode or system of provision of electricity in the near future through the JET-P. Now, the thing is that IPPs want to maximize profit at least cost, right? That's what they want to do. And so if to do it like, and which means that they would rather import renewable technology, right, than purchase that renewable technology locally, if they can do that. So if you're putting all the money, like about 89.4% into committed funds into renewable IPPs, and you're putting about 0.1%, 1.6 billion going into localization, you are not actually making the IPPs happy, because though they will, if you're telling them, you know, you need to ensure that there's local content, right? They will say no, but the costs here are too expensive. Why should I buy locally when I can import?
As you wrap up,
Right? So
as you wrap up, sorry.
as I wrap up, so they'll say, why should I buy locally when I can import? So what you need to do is have a balanced approach where you also have money put into the renewables energy manufacturing sector, cheap financing there, so that it makes them cost competitive. This is exactly how the renewables IPPs emerged. They emerged because they were highly subsidized. Right now, but then you are not really doing much to this other one, the renewables, where the jobs are actually at. So that is the crucial thing. And this continues a particular kind of development where even the IDC, sorry, that graph that I had with many bars, that is a breakdown of IDC financing in the various sectors. If you look at that graph, a lot of it is money that has gone into energy, meaning renewables, over the last 10 years, right? So what we are doing, and very little going into manufacturing. So what we are doing is we are perpetuating this energy, this minerals energy complex, which the renewables energy system is a part of. And we are not actually ensuring a balanced kind of growth where we are targeting renewable energy, but ensuring that we are applying cheap finance to renewable manufacturing so that it's cost competitive and it makes it attractive for them to do local content.
All right.
So last point is that this is why the renewables with IPPs, with the rollout, they said, no, we don't want local content. The state had to reduce the local content threshold from 100% to 35%, right? And in the JET IP, it says we are also going to try and do more flexibility to basically deregulate our PPP controls, right? And one asks, what does that mean for local content? What does that mean for jobs? What does that mean for your job?
Yes.
Trade unionists.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Basani. Okay. Thanks, colleagues. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. You know it's serious when the banners come down.